London, 1851. The annual midsummer ball at Pembroke House unfolded like a tableau of splendour. Chandeliers cast golden light upon the cream of society as they whirled across polished floors, a kaleidoscope of silk, satin, and whispered secrets. From her position against the wall, Miss Harriet Vaughan observed it all with quiet resignation, her gloved hands folded neatly at her waist. Though her gown, a serviceable blue silk, several seasons old but carefully maintained, marked her as different from the glittering débutantes, it was her position that truly separated her from the merriment. Governesses were not invited to dance. They existed in that precarious space between servant and gentlewoman, tolerated at such gatherings only to supervise their young charges. Harriet had long accepted this reality, yet something about tonight, perhaps the particularly sweet violin melody or the rare opportunity to wear her mother's pearl earrings, made her heart ache with unusual intensity. "Miss Vaughan," came a small voice beside her. 10-year-old Lady Sophia Pembroke tugged at her sleeve, wide-eyed and concerned. "Are you quite well? You look rather sad." Harriet summoned a smile. "Perfectly well, my dear. Only a bit tired. Have you enjoyed your permitted hour among the grown-ups?" "Oh, yes. But I think it dreadfully unfair that you must stand here all evening. You're far prettier than Lady Wyndham's daughters, and they've danced every set." "Sophia," Harriet whispered, mortified. "That is not an appropriate comparison. Now, it's nearly 9. Let's find your brother and prepare for bed." As they moved through the crowd, Harriet felt rather than saw the curious gazes following them. 3 months as governess to the Pembroke children had not dulled the sting of whispered speculation. Though her fall from society had not been entirely dramatic, it remained the sort of cautionary tale mothers told wayward daughters. The Vaughan family's financial collapse following her father's death had been swift and merciless. Their country estate sold to cover crushing debts, her mother retreated to live with a distant cousin in Bath, while Harriet, who had once anticipated a respectable match and comfortable future, was thrust into the workforce at 26. "Miss Vaughan," said a low voice that halted her steps. "I believe you've dropped something." Harriet turned to find Frederick Pembrooke, the Duke of Westmoreland, extending a delicate lace handkerchief. Tall and imposing in impeccably tailored evening attire, the Duke was precisely the sort of man who had never deigned to notice her existence, even before her reduced circumstances. "This isn't mine, Your Grace," she replied, careful to keep her tone respectful but distant. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, revealing a hint of warmth in features often described as forbidding. At 33, the Duke had the bearing of a man unaccustomed to contradiction. "Nevertheless, I insist you take it. The evening is warm, and you may have need of it." Before she could protest further, little Sophia intervened. "Uncle Frederick, will you dance with Miss Vaughan? She's been standing all evening, and it's not fair." Harriet felt the blood drain from her face. "Lady Sophia, that is enough." "Your Grace, please excuse, an excellent suggestion, my dear niece," the Duke replied, his expression inscrutable. "Miss Vaughan, would you honor me with the next dance?" The murmurs began immediately. Nearby conversation stuttered to silence as dozens of eyes turned to witness this extraordinary breach of propriety. "I cannot possibly accept," Harriet whispered, acutely aware of the Dowager Duchess's horrified gaze boring into her from across the room. "It would be most inappropriate." "I disagree," he said simply. "And as this is my brother's house, I believe I have some say in what constitutes appropriate behavior. The next dance is a waltz. Do you know the steps?" "Yes, but excellent." "Then it's settled." He offered his arm with the confidence of a man unaccustomed to refusal. Harriet hesitated, torn between mortification and a traitorous flicker of excitement. To refuse a duke was unthinkable, yet to accept meant becoming the object of society's collective contempt. Her reputation, the only thing of value she possessed, would be tainted by speculation. She glanced at Sophia's encouraging face and made her decision. "One dance, Your Grace, and then I really must see Lady Sophia to bed." His smile broadened as he led her toward the dance floor, a path clearing before them like the Red Sea before Moses. I shall hold you to just one, though I suspect I may regret the limitation." As the first notes of the waltz began, Harriet felt dozens of shocked gazes upon her. The Duke of Westmoreland, one of England's most eligible bachelors, dancing with a governess. It was unprecedented, scandalous, the subject of tomorrow's gossip in every drawing-room from Mayfair to Kensington. "You are too rigid, Miss Vaughan," the Duke observed as they began to move. "One might think you were facing the guillotine rather than a simple waltz." "Forgive me if I failed to find humor in my situation," she replied, keeping her voice low. "Your kind gesture, however well-intentioned, will be the subject of vicious speculation. By morning, your aunt will likely have dismissed me." "My aunt will do no such thing, as she values her children's happiness too greatly to disrupt their education on a whim." His hand at her waist guided her through a turn with surprising gentleness. "And as for speculation, let them speculate. I find I care little for society's opinion these days. That is the luxury of your position, Your Grace. Some of us cannot afford such indifference." Something in her tone caused him to study her more closely. "You speak from experience." "I merely understand my place in the world." "And yet," he said thoughtfully, "I wonder if that place is truly where you belong." The music swelled around them, and despite herself, Harriet felt the tension in her shoulders ease. The Duke was an excellent dancer, leading with confidence but without the controlling grip many gentlemen employed. For a few precious moments, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be simply a woman enjoying a dance, rather than a governess committing a social transgression. "You dance beautifully," he remarked. "Not the accomplishment of a typical governess." "I wasn't always a governess," she replied, then immediately regretted her candor. "No," he said, his gaze intensifying. "I imagine you were not." As the final notes of the waltz faded, Harriet stepped back, offering a perfect curtsy. "Thank you for the dance, Your Grace. I must now attend to my duties." The Duke bowed, but as she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Miss Vaughan, I should like to speak with you tomorrow regarding my niece's education. Perhaps in the library, after breakfast." She nodded, conscious of the many eyes still watching them. "As you wish, Your Grace." Harriet retreated with as much dignity as she could muster, collecting Sophia and making her way to the family wing. Behind her, the whispers rose like a tide, washing away whatever momentary pleasure she had found in the Duke's unexpected attention. In the nursery, as she helped Sophia prepare for bed, the child's excitement was palpable. "Everyone was watching you. You looked like a princess in a fairy story." "A cautionary fairy story, perhaps," Harriet replied with a gentle smile. "Now, into bed with you. We have lessons in the morning." "Uncle Frederick never dances at balls," Sophia confided as Harriet tucked the coverlet around her. "Mother says he finds them tedious." "But he danced with you." "Your uncle was merely being kind to your governess." "Nothing more." She kissed the child's forehead. "Sleep well, my dear." Later, in the small but comfortable room that had been hers these past months, Harriet removed her mother's pearl earrings and placed them in their worn velvet box. The memory of the Duke's hand at her waist, the surprising warmth in his eyes, the whispers that followed them across the dance floor, all of it felt like a strange dream from which she had now awakened. Tomorrow, she would meet him in the library as instructed, answer whatever questions he had about Sophia's progress, and then return to the invisible existence she had carved for herself. Tonight's momentary departure from propriety would not be repeated. It could not be. Yet as she extinguished her candle and lay down to sleep, Harriet found herself touching the delicate lace handkerchief she had unconsciously kept. Upon closer inspection in the moonlight streaming through her window, she discovered an embroidered initial in one corner, the letter F, rendered in elegant silver thread. Asterisk. The morning brought no reprieve from the consequences of the previous night's waltz. As Harriet made her way to the library at the appointed hour, she encountered Lady Pembroke's lady's maid, who regarded her with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Vaughan," the maid said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "the entire household is talking of nothing but your dance with the Duke. Cook says she hasn't seen such excitement since the Queen's coronation." Harriet maintained her composure with effort. People must have very little to occupy their minds if a simple dance warrants such attention. Now, if you'll excuse me. The library doors loomed before her, solid oak panels that seemed to guard whatever fate awaited beyond. Harriet smoothed her plain morning dress, dove grey with white collar and cuffs, the very picture of governesses everywhere, and knocked. "Enter," came the Duke's voice, and she obeyed. Frederick Pembrooke stood by the window, morning light illuminating his strong profile. Unlike many aristocrats who devoted themselves to pleasure and indolence, the Duke was known to manage his vast estates with meticulous attention. The evidence lay spread before him, ledgers, correspondence, and maps that he now set aside as she approached. "Miss Vaughan, thank you for coming." He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit." She perched on the edge of the seat, hands folded in her lap. "You wish to discuss Lady Sophia's education, Your Grace?" "Among other matters," he replied, studying her with the same intensity he had shown during their dance. "First, I must apologize if my actions last night caused you any distress." "It was unexpected," she acknowledged carefully, "but no harm done." "I'm afraid that may not be entirely accurate." He sighed, taking his own seat. "My aunt cornered me at breakfast, concerned about that unfortunate impression our dance might create. Apparently, several matrons have already sent notes inquiring about my sudden interest in my niece's governess." Harriet's stomach clenched. "I feared as much. If Her Grace wishes me to tender my resignation, quite the contrary. I informed my aunt that my interest in you was entirely related to a particular educational philosophy I recently encountered. I suggested that I had specifically recommended you for the position based on your familiarity with these methods." Harriet blinked in confusion. "But that's not true. Lady Pembroke hired me through the agency in Bond Street. We had never met before my interview." "Indeed," he agreed with a slight smile. "Which is why I now find myself in the position of needing to make my falsehood true, lest my aunt discover I lied to her face. I don't understand. I need you, Miss Vaughan, to become knowledgeable about Pestalozzi's educational philosophy with all possible haste. I've taken the liberty of having several volumes delivered from my personal library at Westmoreland House." He gestured to a stack of books on the corner of the desk. "These should provide sufficient background for you to discuss the topic intelligently should anyone question you." Harriet stared at him in disbelief. "You fabricated an educational connection between us to explain why you danced with me." "It seemed the simplest solution at the time," he admitted. "Though I'm beginning to reconsider my assessment of simple. Why not simply tell the truth? That you took pity on your niece's governess and offered a dance out of charity." Something hardened in his expression. "Is that what you believe happened, Miss Vaughan?" "What other explanation could there be?" she challenged, forgetting herself momentarily. The Duke leaned forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "Perhaps I dance with you because I wish to dance with you. Because in a room full of artificial smiles and calculated maneuvers, you alone seem genuine. Or perhaps because, having observed you these past weeks with my niece and nephew, I've grown curious about the woman who transformed two rather spoiled children into thoughtful, engaged learners in so short a time." Harriet felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Your Grace, A sharp knock interrupted them, and the door opened to reveal the Dowager Duchess of Pembroke, her expression thunderous. At 63, Lady Augusta Pembroke remained a formidable figure, her silver hair arranged beneath a cap trimmed with costly Belgian lace, her bearing that of a woman accustomed to immediate deference. "Frederick," she said, ignoring Harriet entirely, "I must speak with you urgently. In private." The Duke rose. "Aunt Augusta, Miss Vaughan and I are discussing educational matters of some importance. Perhaps we might, now, Frederick." The Dowager's tone brooked no argument. "It concerns the matter we discussed last week. There have been developments." Something in her words caused the Duke to stiffen. He turned to Harriet with a slight bow. "Miss Vaughan, please excuse us. Take the books with you, and we shall continue our discussion tomorrow. Same time, if you're amenable." Harriet gathered the volumes and curtsied to both aristocrats. "Of course, Your Grace." "Your Grace," she added, acknowledging the dowager, who finally deigned to notice her with the barest of nods. As she slipped from the library, Harriet heard the dowager's voice, low but distinct. "She has arrived in London, Frederick. Lady Prescott sends word that Miss Porter has taken rooms at Claridge's with her mother. They expect your call tomorrow." The door closed behind her before she could hear the Duke's response, but Harriet felt a curious hollowness in her chest. Miss Porter. The name meant nothing to her, yet the dowager's tone suggested significance. Perhaps a potential bride for the Duke? It would explain Lady Augusta's determination to prevent any misunderstanding about his attention to a mere governess. Clutching the educational treatises, Harriet made her way upstairs, reminding herself that the strange interlude that had begun with a waltz was nothing more than that, a momentary departure from the natural order of things, now rightfully corrected. Yet as she passed a mirror in the corridor, she caught sight of her reflection, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with an emotion she dared not name, and wondered when she had become so adept at lying to herself. The following afternoon found Harriet in the garden with her charges, supervising as 12-year-old Master James sketched the formal rose beds while Sophia practiced French vocabulary. The weather was exceptionally fine, the late June sun warming the air without the oppressive heat that would come with July. "Miss Vaughan," James said, looking up from his drawing, "why was grandmother so cross at breakfast? She barely touched her eggs and spoke only to mother about some American lady." "It's not our place to speculate about her Grace's moods," Harriet replied automatically, though her own curiosity had been piqued by the mention of an American. "How is your drawing progressing? Remember to observe the proportions carefully." "I heard Wilson tell Cook that Uncle Frederick is to be married," Sophia announced, abandoning her French entirely. "To an American heiress with a fortune from railroads. Is that true, Miss Vaughan?" Harriet felt an unwelcome twinge at this confirmation of her suspicions. "Servants' gossip is rarely reliable, Sophia. Now, please return to your vocabulary. Le jardin, la fleur, l'arbre." "But Uncle Frederick promised to take us riding in Richmond Park next week," James protested. "He won't if he's to be married, will he?" "Your uncle's personal arrangements are hardly my concern," Harriet said, more sharply than intended. "Now, James, your drawing, please." A shadow fell across the garden table, and Harriet looked up to find the subject of their conversation standing before them. The Duke wore riding clothes, his tall boots slightly dusty, suggesting he had just returned from an excursion. "Uncle Frederick," the children cried in unison, abandoning their lessons entirely. "Are you truly to marry an American lady?" Sophia asked without preamble. "Wilson says she's enormously wealthy but has terrible manners." "Sophia!" Harriet exclaimed, mortified. "Your Grace, I apologize for," the Duke's laugh interrupted her. "No apologies necessary, Miss Vaughan. My niece's directness is refreshing after a morning of diplomatic evasions." He turned to the children. "I am not engaged to anyone, American or otherwise. Wilson would do well to verify his facts before spreading tales." "But grandmother seemed certain," James said. "She told mother it was all but settled." "Your grandmother," Frederick replied dryly, "has been attempting to see me settled for the past decade. Her certainty exceeds the facts." He glanced at Harriet. "I apologize for missing our appointment yesterday, Miss Vaughan. Unexpected obligations claimed my attention. Have you had opportunity to review the materials I provided?" Harriet nodded, grateful for the change of subject. "I have, Your Grace. Pestalozzi's emphasis on sensory learning aligns well with my own approach, though I find his views on mathematics instruction somewhat limited." "Fascinating. Perhaps you might elaborate during a walk?" "The children have been at their lessons for some time. A constitutional would benefit everyone, I think." The suggestion was innocent enough, yet Harriet hesitated. Their waltz had already sparked gossip, a garden stroll would only feed the flames. But refusing would require explaining her reluctance to the children, which seemed equally problematic. "A splendid idea," she conceded. "Children, put away your materials. We shall walk to the duck pond and back before tea." As they set off through the garden, the children darted ahead, leaving Harriet and the Duke to follow at a more sedate pace. They maintained a proper distance between them, but Harriet remained acutely aware of his presence at her side. "Did you truly find Pestalozzi's mathematical approach wanting?" he asked after a moment. "Most educators praise his method of concrete representation before abstract concepts." "I appreciate the principle," Harriet replied, surprised by his genuine interest, "but having taught children of different temperaments, I found some grasp abstract concepts intuitively, without requiring physical manipulation. James, for instance, has a natural affinity for geometry that surpasses many adults." "You speak as someone with considerable experience, yet I understand you've been a governess for only 3 years." Harriet tensed. "My credentials were thoroughly reviewed by Lady Pembroke before my appointment. I'm not questioning your qualifications, Miss Vaughan. Merely observing that your educational philosophy seems unusually developed for someone of your professional tenure." She recognized the implied question and chose her words carefully. "Before circumstances required me to seek employment, I assisted with a small school in our village." "Informally, of course." "Of course," he echoed. "And these circumstances, might they relate to the financial collapse of Sir Edward Vaughan's estate following his passing 3 years ago?" Harriet stopped walking, her heart pounding. "You've been investigating me." The Duke had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I made inquiries. It seemed prudent, given my interest." "Your interest in your niece and nephew's education," she clarified, resuming their walk with stiffer posture. "Among other matters," he replied enigmatically. They reached the duck pond, where the children were already tossing crumbs to a family of mallards. Frederick paused, observing his niece and nephew with genuine affection. "They flourished under your guidance," he said. "James was failing dismally at Eton before my brother withdrew him, you know. 3 tutors resigned in despair before you arrived." "He merely needed the right approach," Harriet said, her professional pride momentarily overriding her discomfort. "James learns by questioning, by challenging. Traditional rote methods only provoke his resistance." "And Sophia?" "Requires structure and clear expectations, but thrives with creative expression. They are quite different learners, but equally capable." Frederick studied her with that now familiar intensity. "You see them, truly see them, as individuals. Not merely as children to be molded into acceptable versions of aristocratic progeny." "All children deserve to be seen for who they are," she replied. "Regardless of their station." "Or the station of their teacher," he suggested. Before Harriet could respond, a commotion from the house drew their attention. A footman was hurrying toward them, his usual decorum forgotten in his haste. "Your Grace," he called. "Lady Pembroke requests your immediate presence. Visitors have arrived unexpectedly, an American lady and her daughter. They're in the drawing room now." Frederick's expression darkened. "Tell my sister-in-law I shall join her shortly." As the footman departed, Harriet found herself unable to meet the Duke's gaze. "You should go, Your Grace. It would be impolite to keep your guests waiting." "Miss Porter and her mother are not my guests," he said flatly. "They are my aunt's latest matrimonial scheme, arrived without invitation or warning." Nevertheless, Harriet insisted, social obligations must be observed. "Children, we must return to the house immediately." As they walked back, the easy conversation between them had vanished, replaced by a silence heavy with unspoken words. At the garden entrance, Frederick paused. "Miss Vaughan, I would appreciate your discretion regarding our conversation. And perhaps we might continue our educational discussion another time." "Of course, Your Grace," she replied with perfect composure, though inside, a small, traitorous part of her heart ached at the inevitable return to reality. A duke with marriage prospects had no business walking in gardens with governesses, discussing educational philosophy or anything else. As she shepherded the children toward the nursery, Harriet caught a glimpse through an open door of the drawing-room's occupants, Lady Pembroke, looking simultaneously flustered and pleased, the Dowager Duchess, regally ensconced in her favorite chair, and 2 women in traveling clothes of obvious quality and American styling, one older, with an expression of determined ambition, and the younger, a striking blonde whose beauty was evident even from a distance. Miss Porter, presumably. The American heiress with railroad millions and the social aspirations to match. The woman who, despite the Duke's protestations, would likely become the next Duchess of Westmoreland. Harriet turned away, focusing on her charges and the safe, predictable routine of the schoolroom. Whatever brief connection she had imagined between herself and Frederick Pembrooke had been nothing but fantasy, a momentary diversion for him, a dangerous indulgence for her. She had allowed herself to forget, however briefly, the immutable rules that governed their world. It was a mistake she would not repeat. The Americans are staying for a fortnight, Sophia announced 3 days later, bursting into the schoolroom after breakfast. And there's to be a garden party on Thursday, and a dinner the following week, and Mother says I may attend for the first hour if I promise to behave impeccably. Harriet looked up from the geography lesson she'd been preparing. That's wonderful, dear. Now, let's focus on the major rivers of Europe, shall we? But don't you want to know about Miss Porter? Sophia pressed, clearly disappointed by her governess's lack of enthusiasm. She has the most extraordinary gowns, and speaks French with a terrible accent, and last night at dinner she told Uncle Frederick that American men are far more gallant than Englishmen. Grandmother nearly choked on her soup. Despite herself, Harriet felt a smile tug at her lips. It seems you found the evening entertaining, at least. Uncle Frederick didn't, James contributed, entering with his Latin grammar. He excused himself directly after dinner, claiming correspondence that couldn't wait. Mother says he's being deliberately difficult. Your uncle's social calendar is not an appropriate topic for the schoolroom, Harriet reminded them. James, conjugate audio in the present tense, please. The children settled into their lessons, but Harriet found her own concentration lacking. Since the Americans' arrival, she had caught only glimpses of the Duke, who seemed to be employing every strategy to minimize his time at Pembroke House. Their educational discussions had not resumed, nor had he sought her out in any capacity, a development that was entirely proper and expected, yet somehow disappointing. The household had been transformed by the visitor's presence. Extra staff had been engaged, flowers delivered daily from the hothouses at Westmoreland House, and a succession of elaborate meals planned. Lady Pembroke, normally content to leave household management to her capable butler and housekeeper, had become unusually involved in every detail. All for the sake of securing a duchess for Westmoreland. A wealthy, well-connected duchess who could bring fresh capital to the ancient duchy and perhaps, in time, produce the necessary heir. Harriet pushed these thoughts aside and focused on Sophia's recitation of European waterways. Her role in this household drama was clear: remain invisible except when performing her duties, avoid any situation that might revive gossip about her dance with the Duke, and prepare herself for the day when she would inevitably seek a new position. Governesses rarely remained with one family for more than a few years, after all. Children grew up, circumstances changed, new arrangements were made. Attachment was a luxury she could ill afford. The morning passed in routine fashion, but as they broke for luncheon, a maid appeared with a message for Harriet. Lady Pembroke requests your presence in the blue drawing-room, Miss Vaughan. At your earliest convenience, she added, though the implication was clear, immediately. Harriet smoothed her hair and straightened her collar. Children, take your meal in the nursery. I shall join you afterward. She made her way downstairs with a sense of foreboding. In her experience, unexpected summonses from employers rarely heralded positive developments. The blue drawing-room, rarely used except for formal visits, contained not only Lady Pembroke but also the Dowager Duchess, Miss Porter and her mother, and, to Harriet's surprise, Frederick, who stood by the window with an expression of barely contained impatience. "Ah, Miss Vaughan," Lady Pembroke said as Harriet entered. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Mrs. Porter has expressed interest in English educational methods, and I remembered your particular expertise in that area." Harriet curtsied, aware of the American's appraising gazes. "I'm happy to answer any questions, though I would hardly consider myself an expert." "Too modest by half," the Dowager Duchess declared. "Frederick assures us you are quite knowledgeable about the latest continental theories, particularly those of the Swiss gentleman with the unpronounceable name." Pestalozzi, Frederick supplied, his expression unreadable. Yes, that's the one. The dowager waved her hand dismissively. Mrs. Porter's daughter attended some prestigious academy in Massachusetts. Miss Porter, what was it called? The Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, the younger American replied in a pleasant, though distinctly nasal, accent. A most progressive institution, though I confess my interests leaned more toward music and languages than scholarly pursuits. Miss Porter was even lovelier at close range, golden-haired, blue-eyed, with the kind of flawless complexion that spoke of youth and excellent health. Her gown, a day dress of lavender silk with exquisite Brussels lace trim, had clearly been created by a superior modiste. Miss Vaughan was educated at home, I understand, Lady Pembroke said, a slight emphasis on home that reminded everyone present of Harriet's reduced circumstances. Indeed, Harriet replied evenly. Though my father engaged excellent tutors, and I was fortunate to have access to an extensive library. Your father was in trade? Mrs. Porter inquired, her tone making the question sound like an accusation. Sir Edward Vaughan was a baronet, the Duke interjected before Harriet could respond. His library at Thornfield Hall was renowned throughout Norfolk. Particularly strong in natural philosophy and classical literature, as I recall. Harriet stared at him, startled by this defense and his knowledge of her family home. Your Grace is well informed. I make it my business to be informed about matters of interest, he replied, holding her gaze a moment longer than strictly necessary. Mrs. Porter, evidently displeased by this exchange, cleared her throat. In America, we place great value on practical education. My Francesca speaks 3 languages, plays the pianoforte exquisitely, and has been presented to President Fillmore himself. How impressive, the Dowager Duchess murmured. One imagined such accomplishments would serve her well in any sphere. Even, perhaps, the highest echelons of English society. The implication hung in the air, as subtle as a sledgehammer. Harriet maintained her composure with effort, keeping her expression neutral despite the awkwardness of being present for what was essentially a matrimonial negotiation. Miss Vaughan, Frederick said suddenly, I've been meaning to ask your opinion on Sophia's French pronunciation. She mentioned you had some concerns about her accent. Yes, Your Grace. Though perhaps this isn't the appropriate time to, nonsense, he interrupted. Mrs. Porter has expressed interest in education, and here we have a practical example. Would you be so kind as to step into the library with me to locate that French grammar we discussed? I believe it might be beneficial for Miss Porter to examine it as well. Before anyone could object, Frederick had opened the drawing-room door and gestured for Harriet to precede him. She had no choice but to comply, acutely aware of the speculative gazes following their departure. The library was mercifully empty. Frederick closed the door behind them and released a long breath. My apologies for the deception, but I required escape before I said something regrettable. Your Grace, I should return immediately, Harriet protested. This is highly irregular, and your absence will be noted. Let it be noted, he said with sudden vehemence. I've endured 3 days of transparent matchmaking, thinly disguised as social visits. My patience is exhausted. Nevertheless, she insisted, your aunt and sister-in-law have gone to considerable trouble to arrange these introductions. As Duke, certain obligations do not include marrying a woman whose primary qualification is her father's railway fortune, he finished. Particularly when my own financial affairs are in perfect order. Harriet hesitated, uncertain how to navigate this unexpected confidence. Miss Porter seems accomplished. Frederick gave a short laugh. Miss Porter is precisely what she has been raised to be, an ornament designed to secure an advantageous match. She has no genuine interest in literature, philosophy, or any subject requiring independent thought. During dinner last evening, she assured me that her only desire is to make her future husband comfortable and to supervise the servants effectively. Many would consider that a perfectly reasonable aspiration for a duchess, Harriet observed. Perhaps. But I find myself hoping for something more from a life partner. He moved to the window, staring out at the garden. My father's marriage was arranged. As was my brother's. Both ended in mutual tolerance at best, active dislike at worst. I had hoped to avoid their example. Harriet felt a surge of sympathy, quickly tempered by pragmatism. Your position affords you choices many lack, Your Grace. Including the choice to remain unwed, if that is your preference. Ah, but there's the rub, he said, turning to face her. I have no objection to marriage itself. Only to marriage without genuine connection, without the possibility of true companionship. There was something in his expression that made Harriet's heart beat faster. A gravity, an intensity that seemed directed at her in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. Your Grace, she began carefully, I'm not certain why you're sharing these thoughts with me. Aren't you? He asked softly. I think you understand perfectly well. Before she could respond, the library door opened. Lady Pembroke stood there, her expression a mixture of confusion and disapproval. Frederick, Mother is asking for you. And the French grammar seems to have been forgotten entirely, she added pointedly. My fault entirely, Frederick replied with perfect composure. Miss Vaughan was just explaining that the text I recalled is actually in the schoolroom. We were about to rejoin you. Lady Pembroke's skeptical gaze moved between them. Well, do hurry. Mrs. Porter is regaling Mother with details of their Newport estate, and I fear Mother's patience for American grandeur is waning rapidly. As they returned to the drawing-room, Harriet maintained a proper distance from the Duke, her mind racing. What had he meant? Surely he couldn't be suggesting. No. It was impossible. Unthinkable. She had misinterpreted his meaning, allowed her foolish heart to hear what it wished to hear rather than the reality of his words. Yet as they rejoined the group and Frederick resumed his position by the window, his gaze met hers briefly across the room. In that momentary connection, Harriet felt a certainty that defied all logic and propriety. Frederick Pembrooke, Duke of Westmoreland, had been on the verge of declaring himself to her. And that was a complication for which she was entirely unprepared. The garden party dawned with perfect summer weather, the kind of day that seemed conjured specifically for al fresco entertainment. Marquees had been erected on the south lawn, a string quartet positioned near the rose garden, and footmen in full livery stationed throughout the grounds to attend to the guests' every need. From her window, Harriet observed the preparations with mixed emotions. She had been instructed to bring the children down at 3 o'clock, allowing them to participate briefly before returning them to the nursery. Her own presence would be tolerated only in her capacity as governess, a functional role, invisible except when needed. She dressed with particular care nonetheless, choosing her best afternoon gown of cornflower blue muslin. Though several seasons out of fashion, it complemented her eyes and had been recently altered to accommodate current styles as much as possible. Her chestnut hair, usually confined to a simple knot, she arranged in a more becoming style, with soft curls framing her face. You look pretty, Miss Vaughan, Sophia declared when Harriet came to help her dress. Like a princess in disguise. Harriet smiled at the child's fanciful comparison. Thank you, dear. Now, let's make sure you look every inch the young lady for your mother's party. By 3 o'clock, the garden was filled with the cream of London society, all curious to meet the Americans who had captured the Dowager Duchess's approval. Harriet guided her charges through the crowd, nodding politely to those who acknowledged her presence, which were few. There's Uncle Frederick, James announced, pointing toward the lily pond where the Duke stood in conversation with several gentlemen. May we go to him? Before Harriet could respond, the children had darted off, weaving through groups of elegantly dressed guests. With a sigh, she followed, careful to maintain a respectful distance as they reached their uncle. Frederick's face lit with genuine pleasure at the sight of his niece and nephew. Ah, the youngest Pembrokes. You both look exceptionally fine today. Miss Vaughan helped me choose my ribbons, Sophia said, twirling to display her sash. And she looks pretty too, doesn't she? The Duke's gaze shifted to Harriet, who felt herself flush under his scrutiny. Indeed she does, he agreed, his voice carrying a warmth that caused his companions to exchange glances. Miss Vaughan, may I present Lord Harding and Mr. Reynolds? Gentlemen, Miss Harriet Vaughan, my niece and nephew's excellent governess. Harriet curtsied, surprised by the formal introduction. Governesses were rarely presented to guests at social gatherings. Miss Vaughan, Lord Harding said with a slight bow. Pembroke tells me you're something of an authority on educational philosophy. I have a daughter approaching school age and find myself increasingly concerned about modern teaching methods. I would hardly call myself an authority, my lord, Harriet replied carefully, though I do take an interest in pedagogical developments. Too modest by half, Frederick interjected. Miss Vaughan's implementation of Pestalozzi's sensory learning approach has transformed my nephew's understanding of mathematics. James, tell Lord Harding about your geometry project. As James launched into an enthusiastic explanation of his work, Harriet found herself drawn into a genuine intellectual discussion with the gentleman. Frederick watched with evident satisfaction, occasionally contributing observations about his niece and nephew's progress that demonstrated more attention to their education than she had realized he paid. Their conversation had attracted others, including several mothers interested in educational matters. Harriet found herself the center of a small group, answering questions about childhood development and learning approaches with growing confidence. It was the kind of intellectual exchange she had once taken for granted in her father's home, where visiting scholars and local gentry had often gathered to discuss ideas of all kinds. She was in the midst of explaining Pestalozzi's approach to natural science when a sudden silence fell over the nearby guests. Following their gazes, Harriet saw Miss Porter approaching, resplendent in a gown of pale pink silk adorned with cascading flounces and ribbon rosettes. Beside her walked the Dowager Duchess, her expression one of triumphant satisfaction. "Frederick, dear," the Dowager called, "Miss Porter has expressed interest in viewing the Italian garden. Would you be so kind as to escort her? I find the paths too uneven for my comfort these days." The Duke's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Aunt." Though I believe Miss Vaughan was about to explain an interesting point about experimental learning. Perhaps Miss Porter would care to join our discussion first. Miss Porter's perfect features arranged themselves into a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. How fascinating. Though I confess educational theories hold limited appeal for me. The cultivation of intellect beyond what is necessary for pleasant conversation seems rather unfeminine, doesn't it? An uncomfortable silence followed this pronouncement. Harriet saw several mothers exchange glances, while Lord Harding's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "An interesting perspective," Frederick replied, his tone neutral but his eyes cold. Though not, I think, one shared by the ladies present, many of whom take an active interest in their children's intellectual development. Miss Porter's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, children's education is different. I merely meant that excessive learning in ladies can lead to unbecoming opinions and behaviors. My mother always says a woman's most important accomplishment is knowing when to remain silent." "A philosophy with which I must respectfully disagree," Frederick said firmly. "The most stimulating conversations in my experience have been with women of education and independent thought, who speak their minds without artificial constraint." His gaze flickered briefly to Harriet, who felt a rush of warmth at this implicit compliment. The Dowager, sensing the conversation had veered in an undesirable direction, intervened swiftly. "The Italian garden awaits, I believe. Frederick." With a slight bow to the assembled group, Frederick offered his arm to Miss Porter. "Miss Vaughan, perhaps you might continue your explanation for those interested while we take our tour." "Of course, Your Grace," Harriet replied, understanding the implicit request to remain and continue the discussion he had initiated. As they departed, Harriet became aware of the speculative glances being cast her way. She had temporarily forgotten her place, allowed herself to be drawn into conversation as though she were a guest rather than an employee. The realization brought a flush of embarrassment. "I should collect the children," she said, preparing to retreat. "Their hour of attendance is nearly complete." "Nonsense," Lord Harding replied. "They're perfectly content, and I, for one, am most interested in hearing more about these experimental methods. My Georgiana has a scientific bent that her governess finds troubling, but which I'm inclined to encourage." Thus encouraged, Harriet resumed her explanation, though with more careful attention to her role as governess rather than intellectual equal. When Frederick and Miss Porter eventually returned from their garden tour, she was still engaged in conversation with several guests, while the children had joined a group of young people playing croquet on the lawn. It appears Miss Vaughan has formed a salon in our absence, Miss Porter observed, her tone light but with an undercurrent of displeasure. Indeed, the dowager agreed, eyeing Harriet with new suspicion. Though perhaps it's time the children returned to the nursery. The adult portion of the entertainment is beginning. Taking this as the dismissal it was, Harriet excused herself and called to the children. James, Sophia. We must go up now. Thank your uncle for allowing you to attend. As the children made their farewells, Frederick moved to Harriet's side. You've made quite an impression today, Miss Vaughan. Lord Harding has asked if you might consider tutoring his daughter when your position here concludes. That's very kind, she replied, maintaining a proper distance between them despite her awareness of curious onlookers. Though I have no plans to leave Pembroke House in the immediate future. No, he agreed, his voice lowering so only she could hear. I sincerely hope you don't. Before she could respond, the dowager appeared at her nephew's elbow. Frederick, the Wintertons have just arrived. You must come greet them immediately. With a brief nod to Harriet, he allowed himself to be led away. She watched him go, then turned her attention to shepherding the children toward the house, conscious of the speculative whispers that followed in their wake. As they reached the terrace, Harriet glanced back. Across the crowded garden, Frederick stood with his aunt and the new arrivals, but his gaze was fixed on her retreating figure. Even at this distance, the intensity of his regard was unmistakable. It was a gaze that promised their conversation was far from concluded. 3 days after the garden party, Harriet received a note delivered by the Duke's personal secretary. Written in Frederick's bold hand on heavy Westmoreland stationery, it requested her presence in the library at 2 o'clock to continue our discussion of educational philosophy, particularly as it relates to fostering independence of thought. She knew she should decline. The careful distance she had maintained since their last private conversation had been deliberate, an attempt to quell the growing speculation about the Duke's Enter, came Frederick's voice. She found him not at the desk, as expected, but standing before the fireplace, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. The library, normally occupied by at least one secretary or household member seeking a book, was conspicuously empty. Miss Vaughan, thank you for coming. He gestured to the chairs arranged near the hearth. Please, sit. Harriet complied, folding her hands in her lap to hide their slight tremor. Your note mentioned educational philosophy, Your Grace. Yes, though I fear that was something of a pretext, he admitted. I wished to speak with you privately, and educational matters seemed the least likely to arouse speculation. I see. She kept her tone neutral, though her heart had begun to race. May I ask what you wish to discuss? Frederick hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite hers. I find myself in a rather unprecedented situation, Miss Vaughan. One that requires both courage and directness to address. I'm not certain I understand. Don't you? He leaned forward slightly. From our first meaningful conversation, I believe we have recognized something in each other, a compatibility of mind and temperament that transcends conventional social boundaries. Harriet felt heat rise to her cheeks. Your Grace, if you're suggesting, I'm suggesting nothing improper, he hastened to add. Rather, I'm attempting, perhaps clumsily, to express that I have developed a deep admiration for you. For your intelligence, your principles, your devotion to the children, and yes, for the woman you are beneath the governess's grey dress. The silence that followed his declaration seemed to pulse between them. Harriet found herself momentarily speechless, torn between the undeniable joy his words evoked and the practical reality of their respective positions. Your Grace, she finally managed, such admiration, however flattering, can lead nowhere. You are a duke. I am a governess. The gulf between us is insurmountable by any measure of society. Is it? He challenged. The woman I've come to admire is not merely a governess but the daughter of Sir Edward Vaughan, educated and accomplished, whose circumstances forced into employment. Had your father's investments not failed, you would move in the same circles as my family. Would the gulf seem so wide then? But they did fail, she replied softly. And I am what I am now, not what I might have been. And what you are, Frederick said with sudden intensity, is the woman with whom I wish to share my life. Harriet, I'm asking you to marry me. The words hung in the air between them, impossible yet undeniably spoken. Harriet stared at him, searching for any sign of jest or confusion, but found only earnest determination in his gaze. You cannot be serious, she whispered. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. He reached for her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she allowed him to take it. I know this is unexpected, perhaps even shocking. But I ask you to consider it not as an impossibility, but as a choice. Your choice. Frederick, she said, using his given name for the first time, have you considered what this would mean? The scandal, the opposition from your family, the potential damage to your position in society. Extensively, he assured her. And I find none of those considerations outweigh my desire for a marriage based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Affection, she repeated. Is that what you feel for me? His expression softened. I believe what I feel for you may be considerably stronger than affection, though I would not presume to declare it more definitively without some encouragement. Harriet withdrew her hand gently, needing distance to think clearly. This is overwhelming. Even if I were inclined to accept such an extraordinary proposal, there are practical considerations. Your aunt has clearly set her heart on your marriage to Miss Porter. The connection would bring significant advantages to your family. My family's advantages are not my primary concern, he replied. And as for my aunt, she will adjust to disappointment, as we all must in life. The Tun will never accept me as Duchess, Harriet pressed. I would be a constant source of embarrassment and ridicule. Some may indeed react poorly, Frederick acknowledged. Others will follow the lead of those with true influence. And those who matter most to me are my brother, my sister-in-law, the children, already hold you in high regard. He rose, moving to the window before turning back to face her. I'm not proposing this on a whim, Harriet. I've observed you for months, coming to know your character through your interactions with the children, your conversations with me, your dignity in the face of reduced circumstances. What I offer is not charity or infatuation, but a partnership I believe would bring lasting happiness to us both. Harriet stood as well, needing to match his stance if she were to maintain any semblance of equilibrium in this extraordinary conversation. You speak of partnership, but have you truly considered what society would say? The Duke who married his niece's governess, it would be the scandal of the season. Let them talk, he said simply. I reached my 30th year having fulfilled every obligation expected of my position except one. Perhaps I've earned the right to choose my own Duchess, based on criteria that matter to me rather than to society at large. His confidence both moved and unsettled her. And if I were to accept, what then? How would we proceed? I would speak to my brother immediately, then to my aunt. The announcement would be made formally, through the proper channels. We would marry by special license, here at Pembroke House, with family present. A small ceremony, dignified but without unnecessary delay. The practical details somehow made his proposal more real, more terrifying in its implications. Harriet felt suddenly light-headed, overwhelmed by possibilities she had never allowed herself to contemplate. I need time, she said finally. This is not a decision I can make in the moment, however compelling your arguments. Frederick nodded, accepting this reasonable response. Of course. Take whatever time you require. But know that my mind is fixed, and no amount of societal pressure or family objection will alter my intention to make you my wife, if you'll have me. A knock at the library door interrupted them. Without waiting for a response, the Dowager Duchess entered, her expression darkening at the sight of Harriet and Frederick standing in close conversation. I apologize for the intrusion, she said in a tone that conveyed no real regret, but Mrs. and Miss Porter have called. They await us in the drawing room, Frederick. How unfortunate that I already have a prior engagement, he replied smoothly. Please convey my regrets. The Dowager's eyes narrowed. What engagement could possibly take precedence over guests who have traveled specifically to see you? Guests, I might add, who represent an exceptional opportunity for our family's continued prominence. I believe that is my concern, aunt, not yours. Frederick's tone had cooled considerably. Miss Vaughan and I are discussing James's education, a matter of some importance to my brother's heir. Indeed. The dowager's gaze shifted to Harriet, who maintained her composure with effort. Well, Miss Vaughan, perhaps you might excuse his grace for a more pressing matter? The children's education can surely wait an hour. Before Harriet could respond, Frederick interjected. Miss Vaughan answers to my brother and sister-in-law regarding the children's schedule, not to you or me, aunt. And as I've said, I have a prior commitment. The tension in the room had become palpable. Harriet, recognizing that her presence was exacerbating the situation, decided to withdraw. Your Grace, she said, addressing the dowager with perfect politeness, His Grace has been most helpful regarding Master James's mathematical studies. However, I believe we've covered the essential points. If you'll both excuse me, the children will be expecting me for their afternoon lessons. She curtsied and moved toward the door, but as she passed Frederick, he spoke again. Miss Vaughan, shall we continue our discussion tomorrow? Same time. The deliberate nature of this appointment, made in the dowager's presence, was not lost on either woman. Harriet hesitated, then nodded. As you wish, Your Grace. As she left the library, she heard the dowager's voice rise in evident displeasure, though the heavy door closing behind her muffled the specific words. Harriet made her way upstairs, her mind whirling with the implications of Frederick's proposal and the confrontation it had already sparked. A duchess. He wanted to make her a duchess. The notion was so fantastical that part of her wondered if she had imagined the entire conversation. Yet the earnestness in his eyes, the deliberate way he had outlined their future, those had been real. As had the dowager's fury at finding them in private consultation. By tomorrow, Harriet knew, the household would be ablaze with speculation. The children's governess, receiving a proposal of marriage from a duke. Impossible. Scandalous. Utterly unthinkable. And yet, as she entered the schoolroom to find her charges awaiting her, Harriet found herself contemplating the unthinkable with increasing seriousness. The following morning brought no opportunity for private reflection. A note arrived before breakfast, not from Frederick but from Lady Pembroke, requesting Harriet's presence in her morning room immediately. The formal tone and unusual timing suggested that the summons related to more than routine household matters. Harriet dressed with particular care, selecting her most severe grey gown and arranging her hair in its simplest style. Whatever awaited her, she would face it with dignity. Lady Pembroke received her seated at her writing desk, a position that emphasized the difference in their stations. The Countess was not an unkind employer, but neither had she ever treated Harriet as anything approaching an equal. Miss Vaughan, thank you for coming so promptly. She gestured to a chair. Please, sit. Harriet complied, maintaining perfect posture despite her apprehension. Is there something amiss with the children's progress, my lady? The children are not the issue, Lady Pembroke replied, studying Harriet with new intensity. My concern relates to certain observations that have been brought to my attention regarding interactions between yourself and my brother-in-law. So it had begun. Harriet had expected this conversation, though perhaps not quite so swiftly. I assure you, my lady, my interactions with His Grace have been entirely proper. Private meetings in the library to discuss educational philosophy might be considered proper in isolation, Lady Pembroke said carefully, but when viewed alongside a waltz at a formal ball, extended conversations at a garden party, and what my mother-in-law describes as a meaningful glances exchanged across crowded rooms. Well, you must see how this creates an impression. I understand your concern, Harriet acknowledged. If my conduct has in any way reflected poorly on your household, I sincerely apologize. Lady Pembroke sighed, her expression softening slightly. Miss Vaughan, let us speak plainly. You are an intelligent woman, and I believe a principled one. You must recognize that whatever attention my brother-in-law has shown you cannot lead to any honorable outcome. He is a duke. You are. A governess, Harriet finished when the Countess hesitated. Yes, my lady, I'm acutely aware of my position. Then you understand why such attention, however flattering, must be discouraged. Frederick has obligations to his title and family that transcend personal inclination. The Porters represent an alliance that would strengthen the dukedom considerably. Harriet hesitated, unsure how to respond without revealing Frederick's proposal, which she felt was his to disclose to his family. His Grace's marital prospects are hardly my concern, my lady. Perhaps they should be, Lady Pembroke suggested, if you truly care for his welfare and reputation. Gossip has already begun. After yesterday's scene in the library, Mother Pembroke was quite beside herself. She fears Frederick is developing a tendre for you that could lead to significant embarrassment for all concerned. The implication was clear, though delicately phrased. The dowager suspected Frederick might be contemplating making Harriet his mistress rather than his wife. My lady, Harriet said firmly, I assure you I would never entertain any arrangement that compromised my principles or his Grace's honor. I believe you, Lady Pembroke replied, surprising her. Which is why I'm speaking to you directly rather than simply terminating your employment. The children adore you, and their progress has been remarkable under your guidance. I would prefer not to disrupt their education if it can be avoided. Relief mingled with wariness in Harriet's response. What would you have me do, my lady? Maintain a proper distance from Frederick. Decline any invitations to private meetings. Perhaps consider taking the children to our country house for a few weeks, until the Porters have concluded their visit and matters have progressed naturally. In other words, until Frederick had proposed to Miss Porter, or at least until the opportunity for him to develop stronger feelings for Harriet had passed. The suggestion was reasonable, measured, and clearly intended to protect everyone involved, including Harriet herself. I understand, she said carefully. And I appreciate your consideration in this delicate matter. Lady Pembroke smiled, evidently relieved by Harriet's compliance. Excellent. I'll make arrangements for your departure tomorrow. Northbrook Hall is lovely in summer, and the children always enjoy the freedom of the countryside. Tomorrow? Harriet echoed, startled by the immediacy of the plan. Yes, I think swift action is best. My mother-in-law has arranged a dinner for tomorrow evening specifically to showcase Miss Porter's accomplishments. Frederick's attendance is essential, and Mother Pembroke fears he might invent some excuse if other distractions remain present. The distraction being herself, Harriet understood perfectly. She was being removed from the equation to facilitate Frederick's courtship of the American heiress. As you wish, my lady, she replied, rising as Lady Pembroke clearly considered their conversation concluded. I'll begin preparations immediately. Thank you, Miss Vaughan. I knew you would be sensible about this. The Countess turned back to her correspondence, dismissing Harriet without further discussion. As Harriet left the morning room, her composed exterior masked a tumult of emotions. The rational part of her mind recognized that Lady Pembroke's solution was elegant and compassionate, a temporary removal rather than dismissal, allowing the infatuation, as the family clearly viewed it, to fade naturally. Far kinder than many employers would have been under similar circumstances. Yet beneath this pragmatic assessment, Harriet felt a deep ache at the thought of leaving without speaking to Frederick again. He was expecting her in the library that afternoon. What would he think when she failed to appear? Would he believe she had rejected his proposal without even the courtesy of a direct response? She had promised to consider his offer, to give it the serious reflection it deserved. Now, it seemed, that opportunity had been taken from her. As she climbed the stairs to the nursery, Harriet confronted the truth she had been avoiding since yesterday's extraordinary conversation. She wanted to accept Frederick's proposal. Despite the scandal it would create, despite the challenges they would face, despite everything sensible and proper, she had fallen in love with the Duke of Westmoreland. And now she was being sent away before she could tell him. The children received the news of their imminent departure for Northbrook Hall with mixed reactions. James was delighted at the prospect of fishing in the lake and exploring the woods, while Sophia lamented missing the special dinner and the opportunity to wear her new sash. But why must we leave so suddenly? She demanded as Harriet supervised the packing of her clothes. Mother said nothing about the country yesterday. It's because of the American ladies, isn't it? Grandmother wants Uncle Frederick to marry Miss Porter, but he doesn't like her at all. I heard him tell father so. Lady Sophia, Harriet admonished gently, it is not appropriate to repeat private conversations you may have overheard. And your mother's decisions regarding the family's movements are not for us to question. But it's not fair. Uncle Frederick promised to show me the new telescope at Westmoreland House next week. And he'll miss us dreadfully if we go away. Harriet focused on folding a muslin dress to hide her expression. I'm sure your uncle understands that your education must continue regardless of social engagements in London. Now, which books would you like to bring for our evening readings? As the day progressed, Harriet found herself watching the clock with increasing anxiety. 2 o'clock approached, the time Frederick expected her in the library. She had briefly considered sending a note explaining her absence, but any written communication seemed too risky. Lady Pembroke had made it clear that distance was to be maintained. At 1:30, a footman appeared at the schoolroom door with a message. His Grace requested Miss Vaughan's assistance in selecting appropriate books for Master James's scientific studies. His Grace awaited her in the library at her earliest convenience. The children, engaged in packing their favorite toys, didn't notice Harriet's momentary hesitation. She should refuse. Lady Pembroke's instructions had been explicit. Yet this might be her only opportunity to explain the situation to Frederick directly, to give him the response his proposal deserved rather than leaving him to wonder. Children, continue with your packing. I must attend to a matter for your uncle. I shall return shortly. Harriet made her way downstairs, her heart pounding. The rational part of her mind screamed that this meeting could only complicate matters, but she silenced it. Whatever came after, Frederick deserved an honest answer. She found him pacing before the library windows, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. At her entrance, he turned. "Harriet," he said, dispensing with formality immediately. "I feared you might not come." "I shouldn't have," she admitted, closing the door behind her but remaining near it. "Lady Pembroke spoke with me this morning. The children and I leave for Northbrook Hall tomorrow." Frederick stilled. "My sister-in-law is sending you away?" "Why?" "I think you know why," Harriet replied quietly. "The Dowager Duchess observed our conversation yesterday. Concerns have been raised about the nature of our interactions." "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I intended to speak with Charles today, to explain my intentions before anyone could misconstrue them. I should have anticipated my aunt's interference." "It's for the best," Harriet said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Your family has made arrangements for you to become better acquainted with Miss Porter. A match with her would bring significant advantages to your dukedom." "A match without affection or respect," he countered. "Harriet, nothing has changed since yesterday. My proposal stands. I wish to marry you, not some American heiress selected by my aunt for her father's railway fortune." Hearing the words again sent a thrill through her, despite the impossible circumstances. "Frederick, be reasonable. Your family would never accept such a match. The scandal would follow us forever." "Let it follow," he said with sudden vehemence. "Do you think I haven't considered the consequences? That I made this decision lightly? I have spent my entire life meeting the expectations of others, as son, as brother, as duke. For once, I wish to follow my own heart rather than the dictates of title and tradition." He moved closer, though still maintaining a proper distance. "The only question that matters is whether you share my feelings. If you do not, I will trouble you no further. But if there is any possibility that you might return my regard, then I ask you not to leave without telling me." Harriet looked up at him, this man who had upended her carefully ordered world with his unexpected attention, his thoughtful conversations, his willingness to see beyond her position to the woman beneath. In his eyes she saw sincerity, determination, and something more vulnerable, hope. "I do return your regard," she admitted softly. "More than I should. More than is wise. But Frederick, wanting something doesn't make it possible. Doesn't it?" He smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since entering the library. "Harriet Vaughan, are you refusing me because you don't wish to marry me, or because you believe society won't allow it?" The latter, of course, she replied. But that doesn't make the obstacle any less real. Then we shall overcome it together. He closed the remaining distance between them, taking her hands in his. Marry me. Not next season, not when society deems it acceptable, but now. By special license, as soon as it can be arranged. The immediacy of his proposal startled her. So quickly? Your family would, my family will adjust, he interrupted. Charles, at least, will support us once he understands this isn't some passing infatuation. And the children will be delighted. And the dowager? Lady Pembroke? The Porters? Harriet pressed, needing him to acknowledge the full extent of the opposition they would face. Frederick's expression hardened slightly. My aunt has attempted to orchestrate my marriage for a decade without success. She will survive this disappointment. As for the Porters, their ambitions were transparent from the outset. They sought a title, not a husband for Miss Porter. They'll find another aristocrat in need of American dollars soon enough. His confidence was both alarming and oddly reassuring. This was not a man given to impulsive decisions, Harriet reminded herself. If Frederick believed they could weather the storm their marriage would create, perhaps they could. If I were to accept, she said carefully, we would need to proceed with transparency and dignity. No elopements, no hint of scandal beyond the unconventional nature of the match itself. Agreed, he replied immediately. I propose to speak with Charles this afternoon, followed by a formal announcement to the family this evening. We would marry by special license within the week, here at Pembroke House, with family present. The concrete details made her dizzy with their implications. So soon? Unless you require more time, he added, his tone softening. Though I confess the prospect of you being whisked away to Northbrook Hall before we can be properly engaged does not appeal. Harriet felt a smile tugging at her lips despite her apprehension. You're determined to upend every plan your family has made, aren't you? Only those that separate me from the woman I love, he replied simply. The word hung between them, momentous and transformative. Love. He had said it without hesitation, without qualification. Frederick, she whispered, unable to form more coherent words. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that made her breath catch. Tell me you'll marry me, Harriet. Tell me you'll be my Duchess, my partner, my wife. The last of her resistance crumbled under the weight of his sincerity and her own heart's longing. Yes, she said softly. Yes, I will marry you. The joy that transformed his expression was answer enough to any lingering doubts. This was no passing fancy, no impulsive decision. Frederick Pembroke, Duke of Westmoreland, loved her truly, deeply, and with full awareness of the challenges their union would face. I must return to the children, she said reluctantly. They'll wonder where I've gone. Of course. He released her hands but continued to gaze at her with undisguised happiness. I'll speak with Charles immediately, then send word once I've made our intentions clear to the family. Until then, perhaps it would be best if you proceeded with preparations for Northbrook as planned. It will prevent my aunt from suspecting anything before I've had the chance to explain properly. Harriet nodded, impressed by his strategic thinking. A wise precaution. Though I confess, the thought of facing your family after your announcement is somewhat terrifying. You've faced worse challenges with greater composure, he reminded her. And you won't face them alone. Not ever again. With a final smile, Harriet slipped from the library, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Whatever came next, family opposition, societal disapproval, the inevitable adjustments of marriage, they would face it together. The governess and the Duke. An unlikely pair, perhaps, but one united by genuine affection, mutual respect, and a shared vision of what marriage could be when based on more than title or fortune. As Harriet climbed the stairs to the nursery, she allowed herself to imagine, for the first time, a future as Duchess of Westmoreland. Not with fear or apprehension, but with quiet determination to prove worthy of the role, and of the remarkable man who had chosen her to share it. The Dowager Duchess's reaction to Frederick's announcement exceeded even Harriet's worst expectations. Absolutely not. Her voice carried clearly through the closed drawing-room doors, where Harriet waited with the children as instructed. "Have you taken leave of your senses entirely, Frederick? A governess? Your brother's employee? The daughter of a bankrupt baronet with nothing to her name but a reputation for respectability? It's unconscionable." Frederick's response was too low to distinguish, but its effect was evident in the dowager's continued protestations. "I don't care if the girl is the reincarnation of Athena herself. Society will never accept her as Duchess. You'll be laughed out of every decent drawing-room in London. Your influence in the Lords will be compromised. The very standing of the dukedom will be called into question." Sophia pressed closer to Harriet, her expression troubled. "Grandmother sounds very angry. Is it because you're to marry Uncle Frederick?" "Yes, dear," Harriet replied honestly. "Your grandmother had hoped for a different match for your uncle." With Miss Porter, James contributed, his tone making clear his opinion of the American. "But Uncle Frederick told father he'd rather remain unmarried forever than tie himself to a woman who considers reading unfeminine." Despite her anxiety, Harriet felt a smile tug at her lips. "Eavesdropping is a poor habit, Master James." Father agreed with him, the boy continued, unrepentant. He said grandmother's obsession with fortune over compatibility nearly ruined his own marriage, and he wouldn't see Frederick sacrificed to the same fate. This unexpected revelation of Lord Pembroke's support eased some of Harriet's tension. If the current Duke approved of their match, the Dowager's opposition, while unpleasant, was not insurmountable. The drawing-room doors suddenly opened, and Frederick emerged, his expression controlled but his eyes blazing with barely suppressed anger. Behind him, the Dowager could be seen gesticulating dramatically to Lady Pembroke, while Lord Pembroke stood by the fireplace, his stance suggesting weary resignation. "Ah, there you are," Frederick said, his voice warming as he caught sight of them. "Children, would you be so kind as to join your parents for a moment? I need to speak with Miss Vaughan privately." As the children scampered into the drawing-room, Frederick took Harriet's arm and guided her a short distance down the corridor, out of earshot of the family but still visible through the open doorway, a concession to propriety that Harriet appreciated. "I won't ask if it went well," she said softly. The Dowager's feelings were quite evident. "My aunt is disappointed," he acknowledged. "As are the Porters, who were apparently informed of my imminent proposal to Miss Porter without my knowledge or consent." Harriet winced. "Frederick, perhaps we should reconsider the timing. A longer engagement would allow your family to adjust to the idea, for society to become accustomed to seeing us together in a new context. And give my aunt more time to undermine our relationship with every tool at her disposal," he countered. "No, Harriet. Delaying will only prolong the opposition, not diminish it. Charles supports us, as does Caroline, though she's understandably concerned about the social implications. And the Porters have already announced their intention to depart for Bath tomorrow. Apparently, Mrs. Porter finds the London air suddenly disagreeable." A grim smile touched his lips. "They'll recover from the disappointment." Miss Porter seemed more relieved than heartbroken, if truth be told. "I suspect she found the prospect of becoming a duchess appealing, but the accompanying husband less so." Despite everything, Harriet felt a twinge of sympathy for the young American. "She'll find a more suitable match, I'm sure." "Undoubtedly." Frederick's expression softened as he gazed at her. "The only question that remains is whether you still wish to proceed, knowing the opposition we face. My aunt will not attend the wedding. She's made that abundantly clear." "And that pains you," Harriet observed. "Less than the prospect of losing you," he replied without hesitation. "Harriet, I won't pretend the path forward will be easy. Society will talk. Some doors may close to us, at least initially. But I believe in time, those who matter will come to see what I see, that you possess every quality a duchess should have, regardless of your current position." His unwavering confidence strengthened her own resolve. "Then yes, Frederick, I still wish to proceed. Though perhaps we might compromise on one point." "Which is?" "Rather than marrying within the week, perhaps we might extend the engagement to a month. Time enough for proper arrangements, for the children to become accustomed to the change in my role, and perhaps for some of the initial shock to subside. Frederick considered this, then nodded. A reasonable compromise. Though I insist on announcing our engagement formally in tomorrow's papers. No secret engagements or ambiguous intentions. Agreed, she said, smiling despite herself at his determination. Though I suspect the announcement alone will create quite a stir. Let it stir, he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. London society has survived far greater scandals than a duke marrying for love rather than advantage. Love. The word still thrilled her, even amid the chaos their decision had created. Frederick loved her, not for her connections or fortune, which were non-existent, but for herself. It was more than she had ever expected to find after her family's downfall. We should rejoin your family, Harriet suggested. Running away will only feed the impression that we have something to hide. As always, your instincts are sound, Frederick agreed, offering his arm in a gesture that was both gentlemanly and deeply significant. By entering his family's presence with Harriet on his arm, he was making a clear statement about her future position. Together, they walked back toward the drawing room, where the dowager's voice could still be heard lamenting the imminent ruin of the Pembroke name. Harriet straightened her spine, summoning the dignity that had seen her through the collapse of her former life and the challenges of her new one. Whatever came next, disapproval, gossip, the inevitable adjustments of marriage, they would face it together. The governess and the duke. An unlikely pair, perhaps, but one united by genuine affection, mutual respect, and a shared vision of what marriage could be when based on more than title or fortune. As they crossed the threshold into the drawing room, conversation ceased. All eyes turned to them, some hostile, some curious, some cautiously supportive. Frederick's hand tightened reassuringly over hers. Lady Pembroke, Harriet said with perfect composure, addressing the Countess directly. I believe we should postpone our departure for Northbrook Hall. It seems circumstances have changed considerably since this morning. The Countess's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Indeed they have, Miss Vaughan. Indeed they have. London, 1851, 6 weeks later the ballroom of Westmoreland House blazed with light, each crystal chandelier reflecting the glow of hundreds of candles. Below, the cream of London society moved in patterns dictated by music and tradition, their jewels catching the light with each turn. From her position near the grand staircase, Harriet observed it all with a blend of wonder and trepidation. Nervous? Frederick asked softly, his hand warm and reassuring at the small of her back. Terrified, she admitted, grateful for his steady presence beside her. Half the guests came only to satisfy their curiosity, and the other half to demonstrate their progressive thinking by acknowledging the Duke's unusual choice. Let them come for whatever reason pleases them, he replied, unconcerned. The fact remains that they came, which means our marriage has been accepted, if not universally approved. Harriet glanced down at the diamond and sapphire wedding ring on her finger, still unfamiliar after 3 weeks of marriage. I suppose even the most determined gossip tires eventually. Particularly when provided with fresher scandal, Frederick added with a hint of satisfaction. Lord Hathaway's elopement with his sister's companion has provided ample distraction. Poor woman, Harriet murmured. To begin marriage under such cloud. Unlike us, who married with perfect propriety and family blessing, he teased gently, though they both knew the blessing had been limited to Lord and Lady Pembroke. The Dowager Duchess had maintained her opposition to the last, refusing to attend the wedding and departing for the continent immediately after. Her Grace might still come around, Harriet suggested, though without much conviction. Given time. My aunt is nothing if not stubborn, Frederick acknowledged. But so am I. And I have never regretted my choice, not for a single moment. The warmth in his gaze made Harriet's heart flutter, even after weeks of marriage. Whatever challenges they had faced, and there had been many, from the cutting remarks of certain society matrons to the barely concealed incredulity of Frederick's peers, the foundation of their relationship had remained solid. Each day brought new discoveries, new conversations, new depth to their connection. It's time, Frederick said, glancing at the clock above the ballroom doors. Are you ready? Harriet took a deep breath, smoothing the skirts of her gown, a creation of blue silk and silver embroidery, more magnificent than anything she had ever worn. "As ready as I'll ever be." With a nod to the majordomo, Frederick led her forward. The servant struck his staff against the marble floor 3 times, the sound cutting through the music and conversation like a blade. "His Grace, the Duke of Westmoreland, and Her Grace, the Duchess of Westmoreland." The ballroom fell silent as all eyes turned toward them. Harriet felt the weight of hundreds of gazes, curious, critical, assessing, but kept her focus on Frederick's reassuring presence at her side. Together, they descended the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on his arm. As they reached the ballroom floor, Frederick spoke in a voice pitched to carry throughout the room. "My wife and I thank you for joining us this evening. It gives us great pleasure to welcome you to Westmoreland House." He turned to Harriet with a smile that was both public declaration and private reassurance. "Your Grace, may I have the honor of the first dance?" "The honor is mine, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. As Frederick led her to the center of the ballroom, the orchestra began a waltz, the same melody they had first danced to at Pembroke House, when he had shocked society by partnering with his niece's governess. The significance was not lost on those who had witnessed that earlier transgression, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. "You planned this," Harriet whispered as they began to move across the floor. "A small reminder of how far we've come," he acknowledged, guiding her through the first turn with the same gentle confidence he had shown that night. "And perhaps a message to those who disapproved." "That you get your way in the end," she suggested, unable to suppress a smile. "That love prevails over convention," he corrected. "That true happiness sometimes requires courage to pursue." As they continued their dance, other couples gradually joined them on the floor. First Lord and Lady Pembroke, showing their support through participation. Then Lord Harding and his wife, whose friendship had been unwavering throughout the tumultuous engagement. One by one, others followed, until the floor was filled with dancing couples, a visible demonstration that whatever private reservations some might harbor, publicly at least, the new Duchess of Westmoreland had been accepted. "Look who's just arrived," Frederick murmured, directing Harriet's gaze toward the ballroom entrance. There, surveying the scene with regal displeasure but undeniably present, stood the Dowager Duchess of Pembroke. Her return from Paris had not been announced, nor had she sent word that she would attend tonight's ball. Yet here she was, her mere presence a concession, however reluctant. "Shall we greet her?" Harriet asked, knowing how much Frederick had felt his aunt's disapproval despite his outward dismissal of it. "When the dance concludes," he agreed. "Let her observe first. Let her see that society has not collapsed because I married for love rather than advantage." As the waltz ended, they made their way toward the Dowager, who remained near the entrance, acknowledging greetings from acquaintances but making no move to fully enter the festivities. "Aunt," Frederick said, his tone respectful despite the tension between them. "This is an unexpected pleasure. We had not heard of your return from Paris." "I arrived yesterday," she replied stiffly. It seemed appropriate to make an appearance, however briefly. Her gaze shifted to Harriet, assessing the transformation from governess to duchess. Whatever she saw, the elegant gown, the family jewels, the quiet dignity with which Harriet carried herself, seemed to give her pause. "Your Grace," Harriet said, offering a perfect curtsy despite the older woman's previous rejection. "Welcome to Westmoreland House. We're honored by your presence." The Dowager's expression remained unreadable. "The Times suggests your first reception as Duchess has been well attended." "I see they were not exaggerating." "We've been fortunate in our friends," Frederick replied, his hand finding Harriet's in a gesture of unity. Something flickered in the Dowager's eyes, not quite approval, but perhaps a reluctant acknowledgement. "The Duchess of Richmond inquired after you yesterday. She suggests a call would not be unwelcome." The significance of this casual remark was enormous. The Duchess of Richmond was among the most influential hostesses in London, her approval a virtual guarantee of social acceptance. If she was willing to receive Harriet, others would follow her lead without question. "How kind," Harriet replied, maintaining her composure despite the momentous nature of this olive branch. "I shall call upon Her Grace tomorrow." The Dowager nodded, then turned her attention back to Frederick. "Your household appears well ordered. I was concerned there might be adjustments during the transition." "My wife," Frederick said with deliberate emphasis, "managed Sir Edward Vaughan's household for years before circumstances forced her into employment. She has approached her duties as Duchess with the same competence she brought to her role as governess." It was as close to a compliment as the Dowager was likely to offer or acknowledge, but it represented a significant shift from her previous position that Harriet was entirely unsuitable for the role of Duchess. "The children ask after you," Harriet said, offering another bridge. "Perhaps you might join us for tea tomorrow? Sophia would be delighted to show you her progress on the pianoforte." For a moment, the Dowager hesitated, pride warring with the evident desire to maintain her relationship with her great-niece and nephew. "I suppose that would be acceptable," she finally conceded. 3 o'clock. "We shall expect you," Frederick confirmed, the barest hint of triumph in his tone. As the Dowager moved away to greet other acquaintances, Frederick turned to Harriet with undisguised admiration. "That," he said quietly, "was masterfully handled." Offering her a path to reconciliation without requiring her to admit she was wrong. "She's your family," Harriet replied simply. "And therefore mine as well, regardless of her feelings toward me. The children adore her, despite her formidable manner, and I would not have them lose that relationship because of tension between us." Frederick's expression softened into the tender look that still made Harriet's heart race. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" "Not since breakfast," she teased. "I was beginning to wonder if your affections had cooled." "Never," he assured her, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur despite their public setting. "Each day I find new reasons to be grateful for your presence in my life. Your intelligence, your kindness, your ability to navigate even the most challenging social waters with grace. Even when those waters are filled with aristocratic sharks. Especially then." He smiled, glancing around the ballroom where their guests continued to dance, dine, and converse, the initial curiosity about the new Duchess having given way to the normal rhythms of a society event. "Look around, Harriet. Not a single person here is still questioning your right to stand beside me. You've won them over, one conversation, one thoughtful gesture at a time." Harriet followed his gaze, acknowledging the truth in his words. The same society that had once ignored her existence now sought her approval. The same matrons who had whispered behind their fans about the Duke's inexplicable interest in a mere governess now courted her friendship. It was a transformation as dramatic as it was unexpected. "We've won them over," she corrected gently. "Your unwavering certainty gave me courage when my own faltered." Frederick's hand tightened around hers. "Dance with me again." "Always," she replied, allowing him to lead her back to the dance floor as the orchestra began another waltz. As they moved together among the glittering crowd, Harriet reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from overlooked governess to Duchess, from resigned acceptance of her reduced circumstances to embracing a future filled with possibility. All because one man had seen beyond her grey dress and modest station to the woman beneath. "What are you thinking?" Frederick asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "That sometimes life offers second chances in the most unexpected ways," she replied. "And that I am very glad I accepted yours." His smile, warm and intimate despite the crowded ballroom, was answer enough. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, navigating society, managing their households, perhaps someday raising children of their own, they would face them together, their unlikely beginning having forged a bond stronger than convention or circumstance. The governess and the Duke. An improbable love story that had scandalized London, challenged tradition, and ultimately, against all expectations, triumphed. As the music swelled around them, Harriet surrendered herself to the joy of the moment, secure in the knowledge that in Frederick's arms she had finally found her true place in the world.